Greetings, thank you for coming. I wanted to make sure you're able to hear me. I think the answer is yes. Hello. My name is Christine Glancey. I'm the executive editor at Rest of World, the nonprofit newsroom covering the impact of technology on the countries and communities outside the Western tech bubble. And I'd like to introduce my panelists here with this setting. In an era where the flow of information is both a lifeline and a battleground, the role of a free press in covering human rights is increasingly vital. Yet the challenges faced by journalists worldwide, from state-sponsored censorship to physical threats, and the rise of deliberate misinformation, are escalating. Today, our panelists, each one dedicated to collecting and employing factual evidence to hold powerful states to account, will explore the crucial role of journalism in addressing human rights and the strategies for industry survival and impact. With me today is Caoilfhionn Gallagher, a distinguished human rights lawyer with 25 years of experience in high-profile international cases. Her work encompasses a broad spectrum of human rights issues, notably arbitrary detention and freedom of expression. She has secured the release of over 75 unjustly imprisoned journalists, bloggers, and activists from countries with repressive regimes, demonstrating a strong commitment to defending those silenced. She's also an expert on journalists' safety and accountability for crimes against journalists. To my far left is Rana Sabbagh. Welcome, Rana. A Jordanian-German investigative reporter and editor and recipient of the ICFJ Media Trailblazer Award for 2024. Her pioneering role in building a vibrant investigative reporting culture in the Middle East and North Africa. With a career that stretches 4 decades and operating in one of the world's most dangerous regions for journalists, Rana is the co-founder of Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism and its first executive director. She has trained a generation of investigative journalists and editors and overseen the production of hundreds of public interest stories. To my immediate left is Ken Roth, who directed Human Rights Watch for nearly 3 decades, leading its global mission to defend human rights in approximately 100 countries. Under his leadership, HRW became a leading international human rights organization, conducting extensive investigations and advocacy. Ken's work has focused on exposing human rights abuses, engaging with world leaders, and pressing for accountability. Ken is currently the Charles and Marie Robertson Visiting Professor at Princeton, and his first book, Righting Wrongs, has just been published. Ken, let's start with you. I have a question for all 3 panelists to open our day. What do you see as the most significant challenge journalists face today when attempting to report on human rights in an environment that is increasing government hostility and defiance of factual reporting?
Okay, well, first, it's a pleasure to be here and to join all of you. You know, when I think back to how the information environment has shifted just in the time that I was running Human Rights Watch, it used to be, I mean, we all remember this as history, that if a government wanted to spread disinformation, it had to contend with these people called journalists and editors. There were, a finite number of media outlets, and you had to go through them. And every once in a while, the Kremlin had Pravda, but it was so obviously clunky that nobody paid any attention to it. But today, it's totally different. One, there's been just a proliferation of different media outlets, but most important, there now is social media, increasingly powered by bots, by artificial intelligence. And so it's easy for governments to spread disinformation. And this is the environment where journalists have to fight, because if you are, a superficial reader, you just see whatever shows up in your social media feed, and a lot of it is garbage. So how do you distinguish the garbage from real journalism? That's the challenge. Now, I do think there's an answer to that, in that people still look for the truth. Not everybody, a lot of people just read whatever shows up. But there is a significant segment of the population that seeks out the truth, and they can find it by going to, media outlets that have a reputation. And so they know to go to, The Guardian or the New York Times or to Human Rights Watch or, places that have a reputation. And in many ways, the best test of the ongoing power of that truth is the behavior of governments. Because if governments thought that it was enough to spread disinformation, they wouldn't bother with censorship. But in fact, they invest an enormous amount in censorship because they know that if they, without that, some people will arrive at the truth, some people will speak the truth, and even though it's not everybody, it's not necessarily the masses, it is a critical segment of society that they are worried about. These are the people who can mobilize opposition. And so I still, am heartened by that. And I think we have to, before we get too self-flagellating, have to recognize that the truth does still matter. And we should recognize that foremost by those who try to suppress the truth.
Rana, as our journalist on the panel, greatest challenge currently?
So I think
You're good, yeah.
the biggest problem today is that in the Middle East, the context is that we are the worst region in the whole world when it comes to free speech, right to political formations, and accountability. So we're even behind all the stands and China, which gives you an idea. But for a journalist that has been working for 40 years, I think the biggest problem today is that we are no longer believed. And we have lost much of our credibility because of social media and the ability of people and politicians to go directly and talk to their people. We are no longer able to hold these people to account when they are talking because we're not there. We're not able to ask informed questions, so they will just drag people on. People have become silos, so if I'm a leftist, I will only listen to the leftists, and if I'm a rightist, I will only listen to the rightists. And this is how masses are mobilized without even having that critical mind. So this is like the biggest problem. The second biggest problem is that in our region, the Gulf countries are investing so much in technology and surveillance that our life has become pretty impossible, and it's even more dangerous for us to protect our sources. So sources come before us, and if I can't protect my source, I'm not willing to let him rot in a jail just for me to have a story. So it means we have to go back to the analog age. We have to use the burner phones. We have to educate our sources about how to use, the different safe channels of communication. And this is really difficult because then they panic. And when they panic, we're unable to have people that talk to us and present us with facts. But I think it takes time until they get used to you and they trust you and they look at your record. However, our job is still very, very important because without us, everyone can do what he likes and the world becomes a jungle. And if there's no free media, I think, and no free press, and no investigative journalism, the world will become one government, one judge, and one propaganda machine, and many, many jails. So I think our job is very important, but it's become extremely difficult, and a few want to stay in it.
Yes, thank you. I see you've kind of leapt ahead to another point and talking a little bit about strategy and protecting of sources. Now, you've trained hundreds of journalists. What do you see are the best strategies or tactics for building an investigative culture or networks of reporters working together?
Sure. I mean, the first thing is when you're working cross-cultural, each person comes from a different background, but each person is the master in his own country, and he gets you the local context. So without having the local colleagues on the ground, you're unable to get the story. But there has to be one person coordinating the whole movement. Mm-hmm. And that person has a big responsibility because that person has to basically make sure that nobody on that team gets into harm's way. We have to sometimes do assessments on the hour. And sometimes if it's too big for me, I used to go directly to my boss, Drew Sullivan. We have amazing security experts on our team. We have lawyers, and we have amazing security people that monitor our communications. We do set up our own channels. OCCRP has invested a lot in countering digital surveillance. And of course, it's my job to pass on the knowledge that I have in terms of the training I've had on surveillance and counter-surveillance and how to make sure nobody is following me or the source. But most importantly, if the story is too difficult, either we drop it for the moment, but we continue together until the right moment comes, or we basically, as OCCRP, I used to basically ask the questions on behalf of my local colleagues so we would be held accountable. But I do believe that when more people put out a story, like when we do these big global investigations with 50 partners, and there's like a big bang, not one single government can pursue us all, but then they will start looking at petty things and trying to make your life difficult on other counts. But then it'll be very difficult to stop.
Thank you. Yeah, I see the larger group working together and publishing as one. Which brings me to Caoilfhionn, our legal expert. Would you address the first question for a moment about the current biggest challenges you see to the journalists?
I mean, it's one of those questions, like what's the biggest challenge or the most significant challenge, that in some ways is quite a pernicious topic to address. It's a bit like being asked, you know, who's your favorite child, or possibly who's your least favorite child, might be a better analogy. I'm conscious that there's people in the room who've walked through fire to be here. I mean, I see my brilliant client, Maria Ressa, who won the Nobel Prize just there with my co-counsel, Janya Ginsu, you know, who is someone who's stood up to the bullies in such a brilliant, brilliant way. You know, I see Karen Kaiser back there, General Counsel of Associated Press, who sued Trump and won this week. So there's people in the room who've really done incredible things. I suppose from my perspective, I'd highlight three things that I think are a particular, very serious, significant challenge at the moment. The first is a trend that I'm increasingly seeing of autocratic regimes targeting media owners in an attempt to take out an entire media ecosystem in one go. So that's what we saw with Duterte, with Maria Ressa, with Rappler in the Philippines, and indeed the targeting of Maria has continued under the Bongbong Marcos administration. It's also what we saw with Jose Ruben Zamora in Guatemala, the founder of El Periodico, a newspaper which was set up from the outset to be anti-corruption, pro-human rights, speaking truth to power. And again, he's faced a whole range of attacks upon him simply for doing his job, for being a journalist. And his son, Jose, is also here this week. Or Jimmy Lai, age 77, my client, in Hong Kong, in prison for, make no mistake, conspiracy to commit journalism. And all of those examples are really pernicious because what they attempted to do, what Duterte attempted to do with Maria and Rappler, what the Guatemalan authorities attempted to do with Jose Ruben Zamora and El Periodico, and what the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities attempted to do with Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily, is to take out the biggest fish. And what that does is not only challenge, not only cause problems for that individual journalist and for that individual media organization, it sends a chilling message to anyone else who dares to speak truth to power in that jurisdiction. So that's a real problem. Second one I'd highlight that's particularly difficult at the moment, something I'm dealing with a lot, is transnational repression. So where repressive regimes are reaching out across borders to try to silence journalists wherever in the world they may be. So particularly dramatic example of that is what Iran is doing, targeting journalists around the world. So I act for Iran International and the BBC News Persian journalists. So hundreds of journalists based in the US and the UK and across Europe. And just this time last year, one of my clients, Puri Azarati, was stabbed in London in broad daylight. His crime? Being a journalist. And these are three individuals who flew in through Heathrow, stabbed him, flew back out. Now, that's a real issue, transnational repression, because we've got systems which are creaking at the seams. Our legal systems don't really work well when you're dealing with a threat from a repressive regime abroad that's targeting people in a different country. It doesn't work very well. And then the third issue, I suppose, I'd highlight is apathy. And there's that tagline for the Washington Post, democracy dies in darkness. I think what many of us are seeing over the last few months is democracy dying in plain sight, and many people letting it happen and not standing up to the bullies, which is why I wanted to highlight Karen Kaiser in the room, who's someone who has rightly stood up to the bullies and has had a great result this week.
Thank you. Amid those three things was the thread of safety, security. I know you have been threatened personally and that you work very often on behalf of people who have. Is there anything that you believe can help journalists as a group, because I know you mentioned the community, is helpful if you're working together as a unit, but also individually?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing, just as a lawyer, just casting a light on my own profession, I would say, is one of the things I've become quite concerned about over the last few years is that quite often you have journalists who've got very good security hygiene themselves. So, know to use Signal, although Signal has also been in the news for the last number of weeks for other reasons. But, know to use secure communications, know how to protect sources. But often the weak point in their network will in fact be their lawyer. So in the last number of years, I've had some very concerning situations where I've had people attempt to instruct me on a case against Saudi Arabia, for example, or Iran, or Russia, and they'll offer to send you material on Google Docs or over open email. And these are situations where often their clients will have much better security protocols than the lawyers will have themselves. So I'd say the first thing is that if you are in a position as a journalist where you're instructing lawyers, make sure your lawyers have got good security protocols, because I'm afraid many people in my profession do not have the same kind of security hygiene that journalists have, and that can be a real problem. So in 25 years, every single time I've done an Iranian case, someone on the legal team has been targeted for hacking, and quite often it's a paralegal or a clerk or someone else. It's not necessarily the person who's got the most experience in dealing with Iran, but that is a routine problem. So I think make sure your lawyers are tooled up. And of course, for other journalists, there's a lot of materials out there on safety. I just highlight one particular issue at the moment, which is the issue about online safety of female journalists. And there's many people here in Perugia doing brilliant work on that, including Julie Passetti. But I do think women, and particularly women of colour, are often at the front line online when it comes to abuse. And one of the biggest issues that I see with many of my clients is the chilling effect, and many women self-censoring, stepping back from spaces. And of course, that's damaging for the individual journalist, but it's damaging for all of us. It means we don't have a proper, diverse media ecosystem, and we all lose out.
Thank you. I want to turn to the question from the specific to the general again, to say, if we're operating in this world where the facts that we're reporting and the gathering of evidence to hold people to account is itself called into question, Ken, in your work, and you're seeing the arc of time from the early 80s when you began at HRW, do you see, how do you feel about the current environment, and are we in a post-truth world, and does journalism still matter when autocrats can spread disinformation and question what might be a common fact in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to address this in my earlier answer, but I mean, let me go a step further in that, I mean, I do think that there are steps that journalists can take to help to fight the disinformation just by making their accounts more credible.
Making them more
credible.
Credible.
In other words, and I mean, this is not rocket science, but it's, it's featuring people, having case discussions, moving past the generalizations. And obviously the people behind disinformation can make up people, but it tends to be harder to do that. They tend to be cardboard characters. And so, providing kind of richness to your account, really, showing the personalities who are affected is one way to not only make it more credible, but of course also to reach people better. Visuals matter a whole lot because, again, they can concoct them, but it's harder to do that. The more you put, these different personal elements into a story, the more believable it is, and the harder it is for those who are trying to just fake the truth to keep up with you. I think on the, on the issue of going after media companies, which is, a big issue, and I think we've seen this, for example, with the Washington Post. Many people thought Jeff Bezos was, an angel investor. He was going to save the Post, and it looked good for a while. But of course, he has much bigger business interests than the Post, and that made him vulnerable. I think this speaks to the importance of having, a range of media outlets that are dedicated to the truth. It also speaks to not-for-profits, which is increasingly part of the media environment. And it's not that they're impossible to get to, their not-for-profit status can be challenged, but it's more difficult because, I mean, if you read the autocrat's handbook, a key tool, what Erdogan does, what Orban does, is to go after the big companies that tend to own media. And they have lots of different business interests, lots of reasons to be nice to the government. And this is, it's a big vulnerability. So I think that, what we've seen here, represented by a number of not-for-profit media companies, is a very important way of pushing back.
Thank you. Rana, in your work, whether your personal work, the pieces that you're working on and you're leading, or in the groups of journalists that you advise, is there any guidance that you could give us for combating disinformation campaigns and combating the erosion of trust in media? What can individuals do to gain back credibility?
I mean, the thing starts with, I feel that most colleagues in my region are very, very basic when it comes to digital security. And they take everything for granted. So the first thing is they all have to go through the source of, training. They have to use encryptions. We even tell them with encryptions, nothing is safe because, for example, we've had the situation in Jordan where an official was accused by the state of collaborating against it, and they were able to ask Signal to provide the data on that person. So we tell them nothing is safe. Even the most secure platform is not safe. We also tell them that when they are writing emails or collecting data on people they are investigating, they should never, ever write bad things about them or just say, I got this bastard or stuff like that, because it will be taken against them in case they go to court. And then there's the data retention law. So the judge will tell the reporter, give me your emails, and he will go through the list of emails. And if he sees that you have a personal interest in taking down that person, if you are right, it becomes, you become the wrong guy. So that's the legal education is very important. They also have to know what the laws are. I was very shocked and astonished when I found that 90% of the Arab journalists I worked with did not even know what their rights and obligations were under their national laws. So it's really, you're trying to educate on all levels. But for me, the most important thing is they have to know that everything they say is monitored. Yeah. Everything they do is monitored. They have to protect their sources. And it was such a turning point. One day we had Seymour Hersh at one of the Arish conferences, and he gave a speech, and he told them, listen, guys, I have never, ever used a computer to write anything on it. I go to people, I write down hand notes, and then I make photocopies, and then I distribute the papers in 3 different locations. I don't use technology. I don't use phones. And I think this is better, because what technology has done is we've lost this ability of connecting with our sources. It's just, hello, I want to see you. They don't know who we are. I don't know who they are. So the traditional way of working as a journalist is much more safe, gets you better results, and in the process, you build trust between you and your source. So these are my takeaways from working in the region with journalists.
And when that moment of reporting is done, and you've done all that critical work, and you're thinking of, you're gathering your facts to present it to an audience, what are you including? How are you thinking in ways to present your information to the world so that it can stand up to scrutiny once it's published?
Well, first of all, at OCCRP, we had a crippling, rigorous fact-checking. I mean, the fact-checker will even tell us, if you wrote the gate was green, show me the color, because it could be light green or dark green. And we used to say, like, for heaven's sake, it's a green door. But she would say, like, if a neighbor lives across and reads, it's a dark green door, and you say it's a light green door, you're going to, like, hurt yourself and nobody will believe you. So we accepted this. And she said, I'm not there to basically kill you. I'm just there as your silent angel trying to help you. What helped us a lot and helps a lot in the Arab world is when you publish a story together with 3 international regional media, because the Arab governments are very sensitive to attacking the foreign media. I wouldn't say that for Egypt. Egypt doesn't care. They can do whatever they like, and the foreign media can go to hell. They will even be expelled. But in general, most of the Arab countries are very critical in terms of not wanting to have a bad reputation. So foreign media helps a lot. And definitely facts are really important, and I keep stressing facts and documents. But the most important thing is if you go to court, you have to present facts. Otherwise, you will just shoot yourself in the leg, and you're ruined as an investigative journalist.
And is it difficult working across publications to have that common set of working practices together, or what are the challenges with creating that unity?
We always work with like-minded colleagues. We shy away from working with the big media in, for example, the Gulf countries, because we know that in Qatar, the top media they have is funded by the state, and it's an agent or a tool of the state. The same for Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, these two people with the UAE are today controlling the whole media scene in the Arab world, whether it's digital, written, etc., and also social media. And they have armies of, we call them flies, electronic flies, and they suddenly appear from all countries, and they start attacking you. So really, that's it. But you have to work with like-minded people. I would also say that a few years ago, the United States had the best investigative units inside their media, and they also dismantled them because of the cost. But what happened is we saw an uprise in the number of NGOs that began. And when we look today at Trump and his decision, for example, to hold foreign aid for the media, I think from the total US aid, there was allocated around 700 million for supporting media, but 100 million from that 700 went to investigative. So they did realize that, there's value to investigative reporting. But unfortunately, the guy now has decided he doesn't want to fund the bad guys. So, we will have to look for alternative funding, and we will have to find a way to generate income without having to depend on donors constantly.
I understand. Did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to maybe change the topic a little bit, because we've been talking about, how do you make your article, your broadcast credible? And that's important. How do you make it safe? But we should also be talking about, how do you persuade the public? And there is this tendency that in a sense we're all implicitly accepting, which is that we're kind of within our bubbles, and you're talking to people who largely share your views. You build consortia, they tend to be with similar media outlets. And so I think if you are a journalist who is trying to persuade people, it's important to find opportunities to speak to people who are not of your persuasion politically. And, at Human Rights Watch, I would make a point of appearing on Fox News. I would make a point of appearing on, RT. And, these were hostile environments, but I thought it was important to try to reach, not necessarily the crazies on the other side. I was never going to persuade them. But there is a movable middle that can shift the political balance in a country. And you don't get to them, simply through sympathetic, progressive media outlets. The same thing is now coming up on social media. And I'm actually really disturbed by everybody abandoning, Twitter, now X. And, I hate Elon Musk's inanities popping up at the top of my feed. But precisely because X has moved to the right, I feel it's important to stay there. If we all go to Blue Sky, we're all talking to ourselves. And so, fine, do Blue Sky, but, don't abandon X. And I think that this effort to sort of really speak to people who are not as sympathetic is a critical part of upholding the truth and ultimately of persuading, the movable middle that will change politics.
Could I just add something on that too? I mean, this is such an important point. And actually, when it comes to much of the work that I do when I'm acting for journalists who are imprisoned, for example, or bereaved families of journalists who've been killed, press freedom is not a partisan issue. It should be apolitical, bipartisan, wherever in the world you are. And all too often, in fact, many of the champions of press freedom come from one side of the political spectrum. And the real dangers of that become apparent when you then have a change of regime and you don't have many friends in power. So something which has been very important in my work has been ensuring that, in fact, you don't fall into the trap of a case being seen as a Democrat case or as a Republican case or as a Labour case or as a Conservative case. because actually journalism matters to us all, whatever our political stripe. And Jimmy Lai is a good example of this. One day last year when I was in Washington, D.C., within the same couple of hours, we had a meeting with Nancy Pelosi and a meeting with Ted Cruz. And that's how it should be. You should have a situation where you actually have friends across the political spectrum. And it's actually something that we're now seeing. If you look at, for example, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration had a real focus on securing the release of arbitrarily detained Americans abroad. I mean, I was in Egypt monitoring a trial when Aya Higazi was released, and what got Aya Higazi out of prison ultimately was a telephone call from President Trump to President Sisi. Now, there was, with Roger Carston's appointment, Spiha's appointment under the first Trump administration, that was then continued rightly under the Biden administration. Look what the Biden administration achieved last August. So all of us who were here in Perugia last year thinking about cases like Evans, like Alsus, Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Irish-American, UK-Canadian detainee also in Russia, Paul Whelan. You think about those cases that seemed intractable this time last year, and then yet you saw, with political will and creative thinking and multiple countries working together, you saw that incredible release in August, which was the largest prisoner swap since the Cold War. But this is an apolitical issue, and it's of vital importance that we ensure that press freedom continues to be seen in that way. So I would agree with the points that Ken has made, and I also think for those of us working in this space, trying to free journalists or trying to secure accountability for journalists, we must ensure that we've got a wide range of political friends, because otherwise I'm afraid you're frozen out for 4 years or 7 years or 5 years, and you're simply not going to get support, and that's not good enough. And just speaking frankly, I've got Jimmy Lai is 77, may die in prison for being a journalist. We, of course, would like to have seen him released under the previous US administration, or indeed under the previous UK administration. But we're now in a position where there's been a total turnaround from Conservative to Labour in the UK, from Democrat to Republican in the US, and whoever does it, it's of vital importance that we get him out of prison before he dies. I mean, similarly, you look at a case like Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, we had very, very widespread support across the European Union from politicians of all stripes, from far left to the right. And that's the way it should be, and we all have to ensure that we don't allow ourselves to fall into a political silo which restricts our options for protecting journalists and securing good outcomes.
Thank you. So maintaining that independence and the objective nature of the press is important for all of these fallout reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate many of our discussions here over the next few days are likely to be thinking about quite rightly, many of the deep concerns that people have with what's happening in the US at the moment. But it's also important to remember that there is a real focus in the US at the moment on tackling hostage-taking and securing the release of arbitrarily detained Americans, particularly abroad. It's a particular challenge for those of us who are working for people where there isn't an American link, and how you ensure that actually you can get leadership from other countries to step up and hold these states to account. But we've got to look at ways that we can work with regimes. If you've cast your vote, the result is not what you wanted, so be it. But you've got to find a way to actually work with who's in power and ensure that we can protect journalists rather than being in the wilderness for years.
Ken, do you agree?
No, very much so. I mean, I think this idea of looking to coalitions that are diverse politically is extremely important. And many of the issues that we're discussing here, the importance of truth, the importance of media freedom, these are not one-sided issues. And it's not hard to find allies on both sides. I think we should not get blinded by the current political landscape in the United States, where the Republican Party is basically afraid of its shadow if it were to cross Trump, because they would get a primary challenge. So that's not normal. And so just as it's possible to build bipartisan coalitions for these issues in the US, we also have to look globally. I mean, how did we survive the first Trump term? By building coalitions of governments that were willing to act without the US presence. And so, we got Venezuela condemned by the UN Human Rights Council really because Trump was absent, because it couldn't be characterized as a Yankee imperialist venture, but rather a group of Latin American democracies plus Canada came forward and were seen as mounting a principled defense. We ended up kind of scrutinizing the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of Yemeni civilians, by working through the Netherlands and building a European coalition around them. There are many examples like this where, by building broad coalitions and often involving, governments of the global south, from Latin America, from parts of, particularly Southern Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, it is possible to build, really broad global coalitions for these issues.
So along those lines, I believe that journalism is not human rights advocacy, but if I were to hand you a magic wand and ask you if you could wave that wand and say, journalists, if you could maybe pull back in something or stop a particular strategy that you have, it's not to your advantage, it's not to human rights advantage, kind of examine your own operations, what would you do with that magic wand?
Okay, I would end both sidism. And I think you all know what I mean by that, which is lazy journalism. This is the story, here's what the other side says, I've done my duty. Okay, that is lazy. And it doesn't serve the truth because the reader looks at your article and they have no idea which side is telling the truth. And I try to instill this at Human Rights Watch. You put your facts out there first, you make your positive case. I then insisted, I want to know what the government says. Ideally, you contact the government and get them to say something. If you can't do that, you know what they would have said. And you put it in the report and say, this is the likely defense. But then you put in the rebuttal. You assess the defense. And that's what journalism should do. In other words, if you're asking the second side, then make your assessment between the two. And do it on the basis of facts, do it on the basis of analysis. If the other side of the both sidism, is just a government clone or some kind of troll, make that clear. Assess them. Don't just treat them as a respected source. But doing that factual analytic work so that by the end of an article, the reader understands where at least you think the truth is, rather than, that's your duty. It's not enough to say, I presented this side and I presented that side and I did my part. So I would really push for an end to this sort of simplistic both-sidism and a real determination to get through what the two sides say to what the truth is, and you should be presenting the truth.
And Caoilfhionn, in your work defending free press, working to protect journalists, is there anything that journalists do that just make you scratch your head?
I'm not going to tell journalists how to do their jobs, but can I make 2 points with the magic wand in hand?
Yeah.
The first one just links to what Ken has just said about assessing the evidence and essentially raising a cynical eyebrow. I think many of you in the room will have seen that horrifying footage of what happened on March 23rd, which contradicted the IDF account of why soldiers opened fire on the convoy of ambulances and the fire truck, which was obtained from a mobile phone in the body of a dead paramedic who'd been buried in sand. And actually seeing that is a really good reminder that actually there are many situations where there is no effective journalistic access, there is no effective civil society access, and the official account which you're given may well not be accurate. We now know that the official account which was given of what happened on March 23rd was not accurate. We can see that with our own eyes from the footage which has now been obtained in that horrific way, which was then published in the New York Times, published around the world. So raising a cynical eyebrow, I think I would add to the point Ken has made. And I suppose the other one I would say is much of my work is for journalists who've been killed or journalists who've suffered horrific attacks, and where there's an ongoing climate of impunity over many, many years. And one of the issues we often have is, you hear that phrase, journalists don't want to become the story, but often journalists don't want to tell the story of other journalists when it's not particularly immediately newsworthy. So just one example of that, I act for the bereaved family of a man called Anton Hammerl, who was killed in Libya in 2011. He was one of 4 journalists who had traveled into Libya in order to be the world's eyes and in order to tell the world about the human rights abuses which were happening at that time. And you might remember 4 journalists were kidnapped together. One of them was Anton Hammerl. One of them was Jim Foley. And then there was another woman called Claire Gillis, and then a Spanish photographer called Manu Bravo. And they were kidnapped and they were held for a period of 7 weeks. And during that time, there was an international campaign to free them, a yellow ribbon campaign, a lot of coverage internationally. And on the day when they were released, my client Penny, Anton's wife, who had a 7-week-old baby at the time and a 7-year-old son, so 2 children, she's at home with her newborn baby. She's told that they're about to be released. She's told to turn on the TV. She turned on CNN and she saw footage of 3 journalists being released, not 4, and Anton was missing. And she got a phone call from Jim Foley after he crossed over the border into Tunisia, who said, "I'm really sorry, Penny, Anton was killed on the day when we were first taken in April 2011. And Jim Foley had witnessed a war crime. He'd witnessed Anton being killed in cold blood in front of 3 other journalists. And there were some efforts initially to try to secure accountability, which came to naught. And Jim Foley was so outraged by what he'd seen that he himself was investigating this war crime at the time when he himself was killed for being a journalist. And his mother, Diane Foley, has become a very close friend of Penny, of Anton's widow, and indeed a friend of mine. And she's recently handed us over Jim Foley's notebooks. So we're now working through Jim Foley's own notebooks. I cannot tell you how hard it is to get people to be interested in the death of Anton Hammerl. Because it's in 2011, it's years old. What's the news hook? Now, the news hook should be that this is a case of ongoing impunity for the death of a journalist in cold blood. And we should be telling those stories. We should be shouting those stories from the rooftops. And they're the stories I find hardest to get airtime for. People are interested in the stories where someone is immediately, in the immediate aftermath when someone's attacked or when someone's killed. And people are interested in the immediate aftermath when someone's taken into prison or when there's real and present danger. The stories that are much harder are those ongoing, long-term impunity cases. Please tell them. We are happy to shout them from the rooftops with you. Those stories need to be told, and it's the only way in which we can get accountability.
Thank you. Rana, do you have closing words, or we have time for questions? I'm sure people will ask.
I mean, I would like to talk about what we as people coming from the South feel sometimes.
Yes.
Like when now in Gaza today, CPJ has documented the killing of at least 170 journalists. I'd like to see one of those Western governments or Western bodies that, uphold the search for truth and accountability to basically set up a fund and sue the people that were in charge of giving orders for the targeted killings, because even CPJ has documented who was killed in crossfire and who was killed in targeted killing. I also feel that we are all journalists, we're all sticking out our lives, but when foreign journalists are kidnapped, there's much more of action and reaction and calling and pleading than when we are jailed. I mean, if I didn't know this amount of people around the world, if someone jailed me, nobody would give a damn about me. And this is what sometimes makes me angry. There is no equal right to people working under autocracies. Let them go to hell. They live under autocracies. We are going to uphold our values. And the second point is, and I'm also German, I'm appalled by how often Western governments are willing to turn a blind eye to an autocrat. Biden went to Saudi Arabia when Jamal Khashoggi was killed. But 4 months before that, they had this huge campaign, we will not deal with them. And he just went to get the money of the Saudis. And the same happens in all the Arab countries. They need them for a certain mission, they shut up. And for me, I feel very sorry because these were the people I looked up to, the Western culture, the Western media, the impartiality, the professionalism. And today I look at it and it's like, what are you doing, guys? Are you kidding me? And this is really sad. I feel like national courts have lost their value, international courts have lost their value. Look at all the cases that are happening at the criminal court. When one country is involved, this country has immunity. I would like to see everybody, whether it's Hamas or it's the PLO or it's Israel, they should all be held accountable if they killed people targetedly. But this will never happen. And I think there has to be global justice. It can't be hand and picked and chosen.
Community again, yeah. Do we have a question from the audience? Yes?
Thank you. My name is Fernando Morales de la Cruz. As the title talks about journalism as an effective tool to upholding human rights, I would just like to call to the attention of everybody here and of us journalists all over the world. I've been to Davos 15 times. The WEF, which claims to be improving the state of the world, has more than 75 million children working in supply chains. And I haven't seen one journalist even ask the president of the WEF this. So I'm really worried about us talking about human rights, the rights of journalists, when we forget the rights of children. And everybody who's a journalist was a child once, as I remember. So I would like every one of us as a journalist to think, okay, maybe we have failed the children who are exploited by corporations, but we shouldn't do that anymore because child labor in corporations continues to increase. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone with a, yes?
Can I just make one point? Wearing another hat, I'm Ireland's Special Rapporteur on Child Protection, and I just wanted to pay tribute to the very many journalists who have done superb work in highlighting a range of child protection issues which would otherwise not have got government attention or international attention. And that includes a very wide range of issues, including child labour, but also including online child sexual exploitation, for example. And certainly in my work, and I'm happy to speak to you afterwards, certainly in my work I've seen brilliant work done by journalists shining a light on topics which has resulted in political attention which otherwise would not have existed. So I just wanted to give that as a slight counterweight.
Thank you. I believe we're at time. Thank you, Rana. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Keelan.